Alright, so the original Planet of the Apes series is extremely political and also not very subtle about it. While I've mentioned a few things about it over the course of talking about this series, I've avoided it for the most part. Partially because I don't care to talk about it, and partially because I do not feel qualified to talk about things like what a movie has to say about racism. Unfortunately, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes is possibly the least subtle and most political movie in the franchise, and beneath had nuke-worshipping cultists who called themselves peaceful. See, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes is a movie about slavery, and specifically, at least in part, seems to be an allegory for black slavery, considering the main ape pretty much tells the one black character in the movie,
You, above everyone else, should understand.
With all that in mind, as much as I'm going to try, it's a bit difficult to talk about this movie without talking about the politics of it a little bit. However, I am both not very educated on the subject and also very white. So, are you guys ready for a YouTuber who has no business bringing up his opinions on a subject does so anyway? Because I am not.
Now you understand why I've kept you away.
So having apes be an allegory for black people seems potentially problematic, and the movie might know this, especially when you consider the introduction of the one black character in the movie, Mr. McDonald, where this exchange happens about him.
What's the matter with him? He love apes or something? Don't it figure?
Which is either just a reference to black people having once been slaves in America, just as the apes are now, or just a racist calling a black guy ape-like. However, I don't think there was any malicious intent with this. The protagonists of Conquest are the apes, or at least humans who are on the side of apes. The vast majority of the humans in this movie continue the trend of the last three movies by being just the worst, and when the ape revolution starts and the humans start to get their comeuppance, I, at least, went, yeah, good, they deserve it. However, despite the fact that it's about a violent uprising, this movie, especially the ending, which I'll talk about in more detail later, makes it clear that it doesn't think of violent race war is the way to go. Shocking, I know. There is in fact nuance in this movie. For those of you that don't know, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes is the story of Zira and Cornelius' son, now an adult named Caesar, and how he, well, starts the ape revolution. Years prior, apes had become pets because all the cats and dogs had died from a space virus brought by the astronauts, because I guess we're introducing alien... Well, I'm not going to get into the conversation about whether viruses are alive or not. People realized the apes were smart enough to do tasks and decided to make them slaves. Of course, these apes have to be trained to do whatever the humans want, and there's an entire industry that does just that. But frankly, they don't seem to do a very good job. We see a decent amount of the training throughout the movie, and I don't know a lot about how to train, but crowding a bunch of apes together while only one ape actually does the thing they're all supposed to be being trained to do doesn't seem like the best option. Neither does whatever this is supposed to be achieving. There is no other information being provided here, just two metal signs. We also see how the apes are trained to not be as scared of fire, something a restaurant owner complains that his ape wasn't well trained for, despite that being something he specifically requested. And yeah, that's probably because the way they train for fire is by a guy just freaking out a bunch of apes by using a flamethrower next to them. Like, yeah, of course that's not gonna work. I feel like in general for training, including when training against fear, you start small and then work up to the more complicated or scarier things. Here, they just start with a flamethrower. Of course that's not gonna work. And that's not to say the apes make that bad slaves. They can do your shopping for you, they can clean, and okay, well actually that seems to be all they can consistently do. We see a lot of looks at apes who are supposed to be doing jobs, but usually what they end up doing is just making things worse. At a hair salon, an ape starts grooming the patrons, and an ape at a library can't find the correct book, and the librarian has to end up finding it herself, making things take twice as long. It's not like the librarian is doing anything while the ape finds the wrong book either. She just stands there. And we've already discussed the ape in a fancy restaurant whose scared of fire and causes a scene. Even the apes that shop and clean, if they're doing a decent job, they still take forever to do anything. Probably because they're being overworked, considering the ape that falls asleep on a bench with her shopping. If you're wondering why I'm spending so much time on the logistics of ape slavery, it's partially because the movie spends so much time on it, but partially to show that the slavery isn't even that useful. Not that I'm pro-slavery, obviously, I'm anti-slavery from a moral standpoint, but usually the reason slavery exists in the first place is that it's helpful to someone. Here, that doesn't seem to be the case, and we end up with a government that seems way too devoted to keeping a system that doesn't even work that well in the first place. This is in part because they're worried there's too many apes and an ape revolution would be devastating, but that doesn't stop them from importing more apes and having ape breeding programs, all to have more slaves that aren't even that good at what they do and are definitely adding to the number of upset apes. In the course of the 6 years since all the cats and dogs died, apes have gone from pets to slaves of convenience to slaves for the sake of slavery. And when you consider that Cornelius and Zira told the humans that ape slavery is what caused the apes to take over, you would think that there would have been some hesitation with ape slavery, or at least some effort to mitigate the number of apes in the city. But no, instead the way to stop the ape revolution is to just be really violent and mean towards the apes, something that definitely won't cause more dissension. What makes all this effort for ape slavery even dumber is that a bunch of humans have lost jobs over this and really want their jobs that, may I remind you, they can definitely do better than the apes, back. But instead, their right to protest, a core American right, is being stifled. All of this almost makes things not only about slavery, but also about companies' desire to have bad labor that sounds like it costs next to nothing, even though it really doesn't, instead of good labor that might cost a bit more, spending way too much effort just to make sure people don't have a job. I'm glad we don't have problems like that these days, though. So what of Caesar, played by Roddy McDowall, who played his father Cornelius in 1968 in Escape? How has he managed to avoid all of this despite being a talking ape, something the government is extremely worried about? Well, for the past 18 years, he stayed at the same circus he was left at the end of Escape, with the circus owner Armando being the only one who knows he can talk. And it would have stayed that way if Armando hadn't decided he had been sheltering Caesar from what had been going on in the world for too long and brought him out, and Caesar hadn't gotten really angry at some cops that were abusing an ape and called them lousy human bastards. Armando tries to play it off as him saying that, but lousy human bastards doesn't make a lot of sense for a human to say. So, of course, Armando gets taken in for questioning, and because he gets detained for too long, Caesar sneaks into a cage of orangutans being imported and gets put into the slave training that we've already discussed are just not very good, including being part of the breeding program that is increasingly ironic considering the fear that people had in the previous movie of Caesar having a child with a dumb ape to create intelligent offspring. I also want to make it clear, though they play it off as a joke kind of in this movie, an intelligent ape and a dumb ape having a child together feels extremely wrong. I don't like it. This is the first time Caesar has seen this kind of stuff, and understandably, he's a bit upset at the trainings that mostly seem to amount to just torture and abuse. Technically, there's some training there, I guess, but not much. A lot of the training also amounts to shouting do and no, which is about as helpful as anything else, but is also relevant to the next movie. So, Caesar gets sold to Governor Breck, the antagonist of the movie, and also the man interrogating Armando, for $1,500 because he's intelligent and docile enough to be the perfect slave. Unfortunately, Caesar will not be seeing Armando again. See, because the year is 1991, 19 years after this movie was released, the creators decided to make some sci-fi technology, including spherical TVs and a device that forces you to tell the truth, which Armando is interrogated under and only manages to escape revealing that Caesar is the talking ape by throwing himself out a window and dying, which seems to be the final straw for Caesar when he finds out while working at the command post. Devastated by the news, shown the horrors the apes have to go through, and given a bit more freedom than most apes because he's one of the governor's slaves, Caesar starts getting apes to help him prepare for the revolution. This preparation comes in two forms. 1. Collect weapons, guns, ammunition, knives, and specifically, kerosene. Sometimes this is done by just stealing from their owners and such, and sometimes this is done by having Caesar write an extra item on a shopping list to make it seem like the owners are asking for what he needs. 2. Acts of disobedience and just generally causing problems, like knocking over trash and setting fire to a restaurant in an attempt to overwhelm the organizations that deal with the apes. Caesar got this idea from the governor himself, who mentioned that if every ape that had an obedience problem was rounded up, the reconditioning centers would be overwhelmed, and indeed they are. What almost stops Caesar's plans before they can be fully realized is, of all things, accurate paperwork and knowledge that there are no chimpanzees from where the cage he slipped into was supposed to have come from. Luckily, he has Mr. McDonald. Mr. McDonald is the right-hand man of the governor, but is sympathetic to the plight of apes, and while he doesn't necessarily agree with Caesar's methods, he does understand that the humans' attempts to crush any rebellion violently will only further aggravate the problem, and does want Caesar saved. So McDonald helps Caesar escape not once, but twice, though the second time is only after a rather intense torture scene where Breck gets proof that Caesar can talk. There's a lot of torture in this movie, and thus we enter the half-hour-long finale that mostly consists of the apes freeing a bunch of apes, setting fire to a lot of the city, and killing a lot of cops. The interesting thing about these fights across the city is that while it is about the apes winning the fights, it's a much more balanced fight, with a lot of folks dying on every side. And while it's not violent in the sense of the blood and guts you see, it still manages to be quite dark. And not just in the color grading. As much as it's great to see the humans get destroyed, this is an extremely messy fight, and most of it is won through sheer numbers more than anything. But that's the point. There's an intentional nuance here that we see even more when the apes invade the command center and capture Breck and McDonald. But before we get to the end of the movie, I want to talk about Governor Breck and his relationship with Caesar. See, besides not talking, Caesar doesn't exactly do a lot to hide the fact that he's an intelligent ape, especially during his introduction to Breck. Part of this comes from the fact that when Breck lets Caesar choose his name from the Bible, a tradition Breck's late wife used to do, he intentionally and immediately chooses Caesar, and the incredible look of defiance that Caesar has after choosing his name, implying, yes, he does know the significance of the name he chose. Now, you would think that this is the moment Caesar's name changes from Milo, which his parents named him, to Caesar, as it shows a decision to become the king of the apes, but no. He starts this movie as Caesar, which I personally think was a missed opportunity. The point is, Roddy McDowall manages to give Caesar a lot of personality through just his facial expressions alone, and this includes when Caesar captures Breck in the finale and gives him a look of, yeah, it is me, I'm not dead, as Breck thought Caesar had died in the torture chamber. Breck is not as good. He's fine for what the movie needs, but feels partially like a caricature of Otto Hesslein, the antagonist of Escape. However, he does have one interesting detail, an explanation for why humans are so cruel to apes, despite the fact that they were originally supposed to be replacements for the cats and dogs humans cared so much for. In short, apes remind humans of what they were, savages and animals, and hate the part of themselves that apes remind them of. It's a classic self-hate that causes you to lash out at others kind of deal, and maybe explains why the slavery feels less like useful slavery and more like an excuse to torture apes. And indeed, maybe the apes aren't as civilized as Caesar likes to think, considering how this all ends, with a speech from Caesar about how apes will rule over the humans and revel in the day humans turn their weapons against each other, and then, despite the pleas of Mr. McDonald, has the apes bludgeon Breck to death. The movie ends with a city burning and a gang of violent apes cheering. The cycle of violence continues. Things aren't better, they're just different, as the new leader of the violence takes charge. It's a disturbing ending, but rather poignant and fitting for such a dark movie. Except that's not what happens. See, apparently the original Conquest of the Planet of the Apes was way more violent and gory and had this original ending that I just told you about. But despite the fact that all three previous movies had a rather depressing endings, apparently this was just too much for test audiences. So, because filming the ending again would cost too much, they instead edited the ending into something that, while technically is happier, has really bad pacing and very obviously looks edited. And it all hinges on a character I haven't talked about, Lisa. Lisa is a chimpanzee and technically Caesar's love interest, or at least his wife in the next movie. She doesn't do a whole lot during this movie, mostly existing on the fringes of whatever is going on. Her main job seems to be looking worried about Caesar's plans while still trying to comfort him in times of need, like when he finds out Armando is dead. On first viewing of this movie, I thought there was a chance she was going to betray Caesar because she couldn't stand the violence he was planning. But in the new ending, she gets a different role. In both endings, she's worried about Breck, but in the new ending, she gets to be the first of the dumb apes to speak, saying no right before Breck would have been murdered. And this gives Caesar pause. Realizing the violence that would continue, he continues his speech by saying that while man will be dominated, it will be with compassion and understanding instead of violence. Now, this, in concept, is an okay ending. Having a character realize that things have gone all wrong and that he's no better than what came before is great. Unfortunately, the execution is terrible, mostly because there was no way they were going to refilm this scene. So instead, we get a dubbed speech from Roddy McDowall and the most obvious reuse of footage possible, obviously avoiding showing Caesar's mouth for most of the speech. To make matters worse, Caesar doesn't sound that upset upon realizing what's happened, and instead continues his speech with the same intensity that he had when he was promoting violence. It all feels extremely disconnected, especially when you see an entire building on fire in the background and they still use the music from the original, much more intense and disturbing ending. It completely ruins what I think is one of the best Planet of the Apes movies otherwise. I don't know whether to recommend this movie because it's so good until suddenly it isn't. Apparently, you can watch the original cut of this movie, so at some point I will probably try to look at that, though I didn't for this. One more thing that I didn't really know where else to put, they don't really talk about it, but Caesar might be telepathic. Part of his conversation with McDonald during the finale has him mention how the Emperor Moth can communicate with another Emperor Moth over a distance of 80 miles. This is not accurate, it's closer to 10 miles, but the idea is that an Emperor Ape, which I guess Caesar is, whatever that means, can communicate across the world, causing all the apes across the 5 continents to start their own revolutions. That, and some of the potential indications that Caesar is silently communicating with apes right before they steal knives or knock over trash bins, is all we get for what feels like a major detail. But then again, this movie also introduces the concept of a space virus and then moves on. So that's 70s sci-fi for you, I guess. I don't know. This movie is mostly good, it's just got some problems.
Tonight, we have seen the birth of the Planet of the Apes!